It's 1812, nighttime, in Nottinghamshire, central England. A group of men with faces blackened with soot approaches a textile factory. They carry sledgehammers and axes. They break down the door. And they start smashing the machines. They call themselves followers of General Ludd, a figure who probably never existed. History will remember them as Luddites. And for decades, they'll be portrayed as ignorant barbarians who hated progress. But the reality is more complex. The Luddites weren't illiterate peasants. They were skilled artisans, croppers, weavers, stocking makers. Workers who for generations had been an elite within the working class, protected by laws that regulated their trade. And now, machines were destroying their way of life. An expert cropper who earned a good wage was being replaced by a machine operated by a child who earned a fraction of his pay. They didn't hate technology. They hated the poverty that technology, in the hands of factory owners, was creating. Today we're going to talk about what happened inside the factories. About the human cost of the Industrial Revolution. And about how workers, after decades of suffering, began to organize and fight. In the previous episode we saw the Industrial Revolution from the production side, machines, factories, soaring productivity. It was an extraordinary economic achievement. But every coin has two sides. And the hidden face of industrialization was brutal. 16-hour days. 6-year-olds working in mines and factories. Constant accidents. Starvation wages. Cities turning into infernos of smoke and overcrowding. The workers' struggle to change those conditions is one of the most important stories in economic history. Because from that struggle came trade unions, labor legislation, and the very concept of workers' rights. To understand why workers rebelled, you need to understand their conditions. In the first textile factories, the typical working day was 14 to 16 hours. 6 days a week. Work started at 5 or 6 in the morning and ended at 8 or 9 at night. Meal breaks were short, 30 or 40 minutes. Factories were noisy, hot, and dangerous. Machines had no safety guards. Accidents were constant, fingers torn off, hands crushed, hair caught in the gears. Injured workers were dismissed without compensation. And then there were the children. Children were the ideal workforce for factory owners. They were small enough to crawl under machines to clean or repair them. They were docile. And they were incredibly cheap. A child earned a fraction of an adult's wage. In coal mines, children worked as trappers, sitting alone in the dark for 12 hours, opening and closing ventilation doors every time a wagon passed. Some were 5 years old. In 1845, Friedrich Engels, a young German businessman whose family owned textile factories in Manchester, published The Condition of the Working Class in England. What he described was horrifying: neighborhoods where families lived in flooded cellars, where cholera and typhus epidemics were constant, where an industrial worker's life expectancy was half that of a rural landowner. Engels was not a neutral observer. He would become Karl Marx's collaborator and one of the founders of modern socialism. But his descriptions of living conditions in Manchester were verifiable and largely accurate. Other observers of the era, including government inspectors, confirmed what Engels described. The first organized response from workers was machine breaking. The Luddites operated between 1811 and 1816, primarily in the textile regions of central and northern England. It's important to understand who they really were. They weren't the poorest. They were skilled artisans, croppers who finished cloth, stocking frame knitters, hand weavers. Workers whose specialized skills had provided them a good standard of living for generations. The new machines specifically destroyed their advantage. An expert cropper needed years of training. A cropping machine could do the same work operated by an apprentice. The artisan wasn't protesting against the machine in the abstract. He was protesting the elimination of the laws protecting his trade and the absence of any compensation for the destruction of his livelihood. The government responded with disproportionate brutality. It sent more soldiers to fight the Luddites than Wellington had on the Iberian Peninsula fighting Napoleon. In 1812, Parliament made machine breaking a capital offense. Several Luddites were hanged. Others were transported to Australia. The Luddites lost. The machines stayed. But their protest raised a question that remains relevant today: when technology destroys jobs, who is responsible for the consequences? The inventor? The entrepreneur? The government? Nobody? As conditions in factories became better known, public pressure for reform grew. And slowly, very slowly, the British Parliament began to legislate. The first law was the Factory Act of 1819. It banned employing children under 9 in cotton factories and limited the working day for those under 16 to 12 hours. But it had no enforcement mechanism. Inspectors didn't exist. The law was systematically broken. The Factory Act of 1833 was more serious. It banned employing children under 9 in all textile factories. It limited the working day for children aged 9 to 13 to 8 hours. And crucially, it created factory inspectors with the power to enforce the law. In 1842, the Mines Act banned women and children under 10 from working in underground mines. In 1847, the 10 Hours Act limited the working day for women and young people to 10 hours. In practice, since factories couldn't run without them, this reduced everyone's working day. Each of these laws was fiercely opposed by industrialists, who argued regulation would destroy British competitiveness. And each was insufficient on its own. But taken together, they represented something revolutionary, the idea that the state has an obligation to protect workers from the excesses of the market. While Parliament legislated from above, workers organized from below. For a long time, that was illegal. The Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800 banned workers from forming associations to negotiate wages or conditions. The stated reason was to prevent conspiracies. The real reason was to maintain employers' power. But workers found ways to organize despite the bans. They created friendly societies, mutual funds that paid members when they were sick or out of work. These were legal, because technically they didn't negotiate wages. But in practice, they were the embryos of trade unions. In 1824, the Combination Acts were repealed. Unions were legalized. And workers began organizing openly. Robert Owen, a Scottish industrialist who ran a factory in New Lanark, was an extraordinary pioneer. Owen proved a factory could be profitable while treating its workers well. At New Lanark, he shortened the working day, banned the employment of young children, provided decent housing, and created a school for workers' children. Owen wasn't just a good boss. He was a visionary who believed cooperation was superior to competition. In 1834 he founded the Grand National Consolidated Trades Union, an attempt to unite all of Britain's workers in a single organization. It failed quickly, but the idea of a unified labor movement had been planted. The next step was logical. If workers wanted laws that protected them, they needed political power. And in early 19th century Britain, most workers couldn't vote. In 1838 the Chartist movement was born, named after the People's Charter that proposed 6 reforms: universal male suffrage, secret ballot, elimination of the property requirement for members of Parliament, payment for MPs, equal electoral districts, and annual elections. Chartism was the first mass political movement of the working class. At its peak, between 1838 and 1848, it collected millions of signatures on petitions to Parliament. Every petition was rejected. Chartism dissolved by the late 1840s. But 5 of its 6 demands eventually became law over the following decades. The movement failed in the short term and triumphed in the long. The tension between capital and labor born in the factories of the 19th century hasn't disappeared. It has evolved. Today, in most developed countries, child labor is banned. Working hours are regulated. Unions are legal. Workers have rights that would have been unimaginable for a Manchester laborer in 1830. But those rights didn't fall from the sky. They were won through decades of struggle, often violent, always difficult. And they endure only as long as society decides to maintain them. When we debate today about the working day, about the minimum wage, about regulating digital work platforms, about whether delivery riders are employees or independent contractors, we're having exactly the same conversation that began in the textile factories of 19th century England. The fundamental question hasn't changed: when the economy produces wealth, how is it shared? 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, the Industrial Revolution created unprecedented wealth, but conditions for workers in the first decades were brutal. 16-hour days, child labor, constant accidents, starvation wages. Second, workers' resistance evolved from the Luddites' machine breaking to legalized unions and the Chartist movement. The struggle was long, difficult, and often violent. Third, the Factory Acts represented a new and powerful idea, that the state has the responsibility to protect workers from the excesses of the free market. That idea is one of the foundations of the modern world of work. The struggle between factory owners and workers raised a fundamental question: what kind of economic system was this? It had no name, no designer, no constitution. It had emerged from centuries of change: the feudal collapse, mercantile ambition, colonial wealth, technological revolution. In our last episode, we give it a name. That's next time.